Very pleased to welcome you to this talk, this special talk, we can say. I'm pleased to welcome Neysun Mahboubi. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Mahboubi.
Mahboubi, okay. So Neysun has indeed granted us this visit. Giulio Pugliese is usually the one who's hosting these events when it comes to China and in the Pacific. So indeed, a guest host here today. That does not mean that I'm absolutely very pleased about this topic. So Neysun is director of the Penn Project of the Future of US-China Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. So coming from afar. And his primary academic interests are in the areas of administrative law, comparative law, and Chinese law. And his current writing focuses on the development of modern Chinese administrative law. Very intriguing. His talk today is going to be about the ongoing crisis in US-China relations and implications for Europe, competitive dynamics, and the quest for European support. So we're very intrigued by this talk, Neysun, and indeed, I will give you the floor for about 30 minutes or as long as you see fit. And then we're going to open up for this conversation and discussion.
Yeah, so thank you all for joining today on what is truly a glorious day here in Florence. So the fact that you are spending some of your time with me today is really a privilege and an honor beyond just the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Simone, for the kind introduction, and thank you to my dear friend Giulio Pugliese for the invitation. Sorry he wasn't able to be here today, but I got to see him quite a lot over the last few days in context that I'll explain in a moment. I come to you all on this topic after having spent pretty much the last week in various European cities, having various dialogues about how the increasing toxicity in US-China relations impacts choices before European governments and before the EU as a whole, what path may be visible to European governments or the EU as a whole, and to what degree the European context may be moving in the same direction as the United States in its relations with China, and to what extent is it carving out possibly a different role. I'm having this conversation with you today just on the eve of Chancellor Scholz's visit to Beijing and his meeting with President Xi Jinping, and a few weeks before Xi Jinping will visit France for a summit with President Macron. So this is an interesting moment in the landscape of relations between Europe and European countries and China. And even though I'm not myself European or embedded in the European context, I have had the chance over the last few years to be in dialogue with a number of Europeans who are thinking about the implications of China's rise, and was just able to spend a good bit of time with them this last 10 days. So I come to you as charged up with these issues as I ever am. I'm mindful that I'm speaking to you all at this particular institution, the European University Institute, which is founded on the idea of Europe and of thinking what Europe is and how it might develop. And I'm sure there are lots of different issues that pose what I'm about to say as a challenge, but the issue of how to address China's rise has certainly made clear the limitations of the European model. There is no convergence really yet in European approaches towards China. There's quite a lot of difference between European countries and between different European countries and the EU. There's also still, to some extent, a robust debate within particular European countries. So I think every time I say Europe in my short remarks here, I want to append a footnote that I understand that to what extent Europe is a unified entity in this picture is very much in question, and something that we should talk about. I am going to say a few words about US-China relations, which is perhaps odd to do in a context like this. But I think there's an intellectual reason to do that, which is that the landscape of U.S.-China relations, which has become an increasingly fraught and difficult one, notwithstanding some efforts by the Biden administration to stabilize a little bit from the worst moments under the Trump administration, but still it's a very fraught relationship. And it is probably the defining geopolitical relationship for both of those countries for the foreseeable future. I think that's certainly true for the US, and I'm sure it's true for China as well. But it is also then something that the rest of the world has to react to. So even though, US-China is not itself intrinsically a European concern, European countries and the EU as a whole have to react to the level of complexity in the US-China relationship right now. And that's also true of countries in other parts of the world. So I think it's helpful to say just a few initial words about what is the current state of US-China relations. And I was privileged to speak about some of these themes when I was here in October 2021. And I, at the time, which was still relatively early in the Biden administration, I used the title of The Crisis in US-China Relations and the Implications for Europe. And now I can just add in parens the ongoing crisis, because it has not abated and, if anything, is becoming more deep and systemic. I'm teaching at Penn this semester a class on the history of US-China relations, and it is truly a very, I think, unique relationship. The US and China have been intertwined in a way that I don't think China has been intertwined with practically any other country, including the European countries that were in China earlier than the US, when the US finally got there in the mid-18th century. Many other European countries and, of course, the United Kingdom had already really established footholds. And so for a long time, the US was playing catch up. But a combination of factors that are too complex to detail now, but include that the US was playing catch up and so thought they had to play a different kind of a role than they perceived the European countries doing. And because there was something about the possibilities that China presented that appealed to maybe the messianic conceptions that Americans had then and maybe perhaps still have today. That sort of, I think, really laid the groundwork for what we sometimes call a special relationship. And that relationship went through different iterations. Obviously, the Communist Revolution of 1949 put a major moment of rupture in the relationship. And for quite some time, the US and China had very little to do with one another. But once the Nixon administration basically set in motion the process of normalizing diplomatic relations, all of that legacy of the US-China relationship before the rupture of 1949 informed the very quick development of a very, very deep and intertwined relationship. And I think kind of the highest point of that relationship was probably in the early 2000s when the then Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick gave a speech to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in the context of the aftermath of 9/11 and the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, basically pleading with China to become, in his words, a responsible stakeholder that would help the United States to uphold the liberal international order. It was a speech that would be almost unimaginable for anyone of that position in the United States to give today. But it was at a time where it was not clear at all that China was going to turn into what we now perceive as our greatest geopolitical challenge, our systemic rival. And it's interesting to just contemplate for a moment how we got from 2005 to 2024, where the landscape has changed so much. This landscape that I think, European countries and the EU have to respond to in some way. I think there are three variables that are really important to emphasize. One, that China, after joining the WTO, became much stronger economically and militarily than even probably the most optimistic projections in the late 90s and early 2000s anticipated. I think just that reality poses a challenge that would probably change the relationship in some important ways. Clearly, when the Clinton administration at the time, building on the efforts of the Bush administration, was negotiating the grant of permanent most favored nation trading status in the late 90s with a view towards China's entry into the WTO, it was understood that this would benefit the Chinese economy. I don't think anyone thought at the time that it would benefit the Chinese economy as much as it has. In much the same way that the Kissinger and Nixon efforts to normalize relations with China in the 1970s were entirely thinking about geopolitics and did not anticipate that trade would become such an enormous part of the relationship between the US and China. So that's just one variable. Just it's an easy one to state, but it's important to state up front that China has just become much stronger economically and militarily than I think anyone had really anticipated. The second variable is that as it's done so, it has not only not continued to move in some direction of liberalization, both economically and politically, that if you look at the language of even just like President Clinton himself and Clinton administration officials in the 1990s, it was not that they were promising that China was going to turn into a Western-style Western-style democracy or private market in exactly the same way that we have in the US or in the West generally, but there was embedded in their conception of what would happen with China's entry to the WTO and China's continued economic rise, that some processes of liberalization would continue to take place, both in terms of economics and in terms of the political system in China. That was always, I think, a cautious vision. It was never, those of us who includes myself, who were looking at some of the legal reforms of the 90s and 2000s, some of the very small-scale political reforms, we never, I feel quite strongly about this, we never thought that China was on the cusp of turning into, again, a Western-style democracy, but there was a sense it was liberalizing in some kind of important way. And it's not just that momentum has stalled under Xi Jinping. It seems to have actually gone in the reverse. China today, after 10 years under Xi Jinping, is more illiberal politically and economically than it was 10 years ago. And so you take those two variables and you combine them, you have already the makings of a very difficult challenge, a burgeoning superpower with economic and military capacities that far exceeded our anticipations, which also did not move in the direction of liberalization and relatedly did not move in the direction that Robert Zoellick had anticipated or had hoped for in 2005 when he hoped that China would become a responsible stakeholder on the world stage. Of course, that's a very US perspective, a perspective of what we think matters in terms of the liberal international order. But at least from that perspective, there are lots of ways that we can see that China has not been contributing in the direction that at least Robert Zoellick had hoped they would in 2005. And we can talk about some of the examples, but of course, the war in Ukraine is the most pressing one on our table right now that we can look at that issue most clearly. And then the third variable that I just want to say a word about is that the US has changed a lot since the mid-90s, late 90s, since that euphoria of the post-Cold War era, that sense of national confidence that we had leading up to September 11th. The US, I think, has certainly, as you all will know quite well, experienced a very disruptive political moment with the first Trump presidency, may be on the precipice of a similar moment if Donald Trump is reelected. We are a more polarized and divided society than maybe we were in the past. And I think that has also projected itself into a lack of confidence in who we are and what we stand for on the world stage, which informs then how we see this rising challenge, which is a real challenge, but it's the lens through which we see it. So out of that mix of variables, it almost seems preordained that U.S.-China relations would move in an increasingly toxic direction. There is a strong bipartisan consensus in Washington now that it's important to be tough on China, to contain China, to confront China in any respects that we perceive the challenge to be emanating. And that is something that the Trump administration probably accelerated with especially their policies around trade in the early part of the Trump administration, but then also the broader aggressive actions that were taken after the COVID-19 pandemic and after President Trump really kind of unleashed all the people in his administration who wanted to take different types of tough positions vis-a-vis China. The Biden administration has kept much of those policies in place. The tariffs that President Biden himself, when he was campaigning for president, he said that the tariffs had been felt by ordinary American citizens in their pocketbooks and that they were a mistake. The Biden administration has done nothing to remove those tariffs and has signaled in no way that they have any interest in doing that for the foreseeable future. The securitized atmosphere that the Trump administration cultivated around China remains in many ways robust. The Department of Justice's China Initiative, which was particularly investigating Chinese scientists for possible ties of espionage, has formally been ended, but the legislation to bring it back remains in discussion, and a lot of the thinking that went into that remains quite robust in DC. I think the Biden administration, more so than the Trump administration, is actively reinvigorating alliances both in Europe and in Asia with a particular view to containing China. So, if anything, that builds on what some people in the Trump administration had hoped to do. What they have also done has been to somewhat stabilize the rhetoric around China and to demonstrate some interest in in-person meetings, especially after the pandemic. Janet Yellen was just there. Tony Blinken's about to go. There is language from the U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, that suggests that we think it's important for American students to go back to China, that it's in the American national interest for American students to learn something about China. That's Ambassador Burns's direct quote. But that is all against the larger backdrop of a pretty fundamental commitment now to vigorous competition with China that is unlikely to change anytime in the near future. And perhaps, the vision is to prevent this toxic relationship from spilling out into outright conflict. And there are lots of different possibilities for that, whether it's over Taiwan or over the South China Sea. There's lots of potential triggers, but I think even if we are able to avoid conflict, this general landscape of extreme competition is going to remain the case for some time. And it's important to say it's not just because of any reactive elements from the US administrations, it's because China has done some things to provoke those reactions. So this is not, the blame for this is not just reside on the US side. The blame, I think, is well shared on both sides. And, it's almost pointless to play the chicken and egg game at this point. It's just these actions and reactions have brought us to this point. So how does Europe respond to all of this? What are the implications for Europe where, I think most European countries have quite a great deal of alignment with the U.S. in terms of values, in terms of commitment to a certain kind of international order, to certain security architectures, but are open and have long been open to trade and economic ties with China that China has been emphasizing with ever greater robustness in recent years. There are lots of different ways to think about that trade relationship, but you could talk about Volkswagen building and selling cars in China. You could talk about the Chinese investing in the Greek port of Piraeus. You could talk about Chinese investment in Hungary. You could talk about French businesses wanting to sell their goods in China. There's lots of different points on that spectrum, but the general conclusion is that this is an important economic relationship for Europe as a whole, for European countries. And so as much as there is alignment with the US on values and the security architecture, there is also other sets of considerations that European capitals and the EU Commission have to weigh as well. What I have perceived in my couple of years now of engaging with Europeans on these issues and in this last week is that certainly, and this is, perhaps not the most electric insight, but is important to state that the war in Ukraine and the perception of Chinese support for the Russian position has hurt China's positionality within Europe to a great degree, probably to a greater degree than they even expected. It was just reported today in the Wall Street Journal that the German delegation and Chancellor Scholz in particular are going to make this a particular point of emphasis in their conversation with Xi Jinping, that China really should stop supporting Russia in the ways that it has, both rhetorically and economically, possibly even to some degree militarily. That's something we're all talking about right now, whether there is some kind of military contribution that China is making. That issue, I think, has, when I was here in October of 2021, the big issue had been that the short-lived comprehensive agreement on investment that had been announced in December 2020 had died a very sudden death in May of 2021 around the issues of tit-for-tat sanctions and retaliation because of Lithuania's sort of conflict on some issues with China. But what is much more of a robust issue today is China's support for Russia. And the Chinese would maybe take issue with that. They would say that they are more neutral, but it is very clear that rhetorically, economically, and perhaps even militarily, China has been tilting towards Russia and has spoken, much more with the Russian side than with the Ukrainian side. That said, just by the virtue of those meetings that we're seeing now, Scholz's meeting, which is his second meeting, Macron's welcoming Xi Jinping, it's clear that there's still an interest in finding some way forward with China that is not the extremely polarized, fraught relationship that the US and China enjoy. There is still some reservoir of trust between European leaders, European countries, maybe the EU as a whole, and the Chinese that is basically non-existent on the US side, notwithstanding these stabilizing conversations that President Biden himself and some of his leading cabinet officials have had with their Chinese counterparts in the recent year and a half. What is that going to look like? I think there's a couple of different possibilities going forward. One is that Europe does successfully, or at least European countries who are so inclined, do successfully carve out something different from what the US is trying to do. And the Chinese are clearly, diplomatically, are trying to, as much as they can, to bring that out from European decision makers. That's certainly plausible. And as someone who is personally quite concerned about how much the US-China relationship has descended into this very fractious state, I think that could be useful because it could reflect back into our discussions about China and the US if the Europeans are doing something vis-a-vis China that is broadly consistent with us, but is taking some different choices, I think has a potentially useful role to play in our context. Another possibility is that Europe increasingly falls into precise alignment with the US. And I think there are a few variables that will determine that, and one of them is probably who's the next president. A transatlanticist president like President Biden probably has a better shot at kind of nudging Europeans in the direction that he wants policy to go. A more destabilizing president for transatlantic relations like Donald Trump may not have the capacity to do that. And I think already you're seeing a number of European leaders hedging for that possibility that they may have to deal again with the more chaotic environment for transatlantic relations that the Trump administration introduced. A third possibility is that there will be extreme divergence in Europe. And at the moment, I think that's what I think is, of those possibilities, the more likely one. We're already seeing some fractures. Most clearly, the Hungarian position vis-a-vis China is quite different from what is some zone of general commonality from other European countries. But then even within, the different European countries that are not Hungary, I think you see differences between France and Germany and maybe the Baltic states. The Baltic states are, I think the concerns about Putin's aggression are widely shared in many of these countries, but in the Baltic states, they're particularly acute. And so I think, the kinds of considerations that are driving the economic thinking of the Germans and the French vis-a-vis China are not going to be as persuasive in Vilnius, possibly. Then you have the question that we were starting to talk a little about of Chinese investment in Europe. And I think there are a few places where that investment has triggered sort of counter reactions, but in a lot of places it seems to be going generally well for the Chinese. And I would argue, having just spent the last few days in Greece, that Greece is one of those places that there may be some questioning of like what exactly is going on with Piraeus, but on the other hand, like Chinese investment in Piraeus has really made that port a much bigger player in shipping than it was before. And it would be very hard to go and say that conclusively that this has not worked out so far to the benefit of the Greek economy and Greek interests. And I think there are a few other examples like that in Southern and Eastern Europe that the Chinese could point as wins. What I would maybe conclude with, and then very much want to hear your reactions to any of this, and especially my read on how this kind of, what are the implications for Europe of this, this dramatic geopolitical story at the moment. I think it does really force us to ask, what is Europe? Is Europe just a economic confederation without a foreign policy and with very little connectivity on political issues? Is it something else? If it is something else, what are the drivers that are going to take in that direction? Is something like the challenge that China is posing militarily, economically, politically, as it grows stronger, is that the kind of thing that can serve to maybe knit together the aspects of European identity that remain inchoate? Or is it something that would potentially make it even harder to knit together? I think in a European context, that's a particularly interesting question to ask. I do feel bad that so much of the thinking is somewhat reactive to what's happening with the US and China. I think Europe, and maybe particularly Europeans, generally would prefer not to have to be reactive to that, but I do think it's a reality. And understanding it may be one step towards then thinking through what are really the implications for Europe in this very challenging moment. So let me stop there, and I'm very curious to see what people's reactions are and have a conversation.
Yeah, Thank you so very much, Neysun. That is absolutely great to getting us started on our discussions. Maybe I can just start. I mean, please, you will probably be experts in your fields, and I'm coming to this as a generalist, I would say. First of all, refreshing to hear a talk like this without mentioning Taiwan. But I am curious to how you see this construction, let's say, of the focal point of Taiwan featuring into this, especially since Europe, let's say, is by and large probably, let's say, less interested in the security narrative around Taiwan. But I wanted to hear your view on how that features in. And the second component that, let's say, you did not talk about, and that's interesting for me, is human rights, which has been an issue, I think, for the Europeans, but also very much for the US in the kind of securitization of certain narratives as well. So I was curious to why you admitted those, or if you think that they are, we're beyond that somehow in terms of the human rights, not in terms of Taiwan. And then just a third point, which is maybe a little bit provocative, just to get us started. What's the problem really with this construction of this intense competition? In many ways, I mean, China is maybe it's kind of the perfect other. I mean, there is something about, I think, the way that international politics perhaps work, perhaps also very much in a kind of an American mindset of how international relations work, that kind of need this other. And China somehow ticks a lot of boxes. It's got that communist heritage. Maybe there's lots of other things that is kind of clear that, the US and the American society as well can kind of define itself against. And then the end of the day, so far, indeed, Taiwan, it's kind of messing up with this perhaps architecture, but it hasn't been aggressive, right? And it hasn't, there is a lot of cohabitation, right, with China. Indeed, okay, local competition and so on, but also a lot of mutual benefits. And by and large, China is a little obnoxious when it comes to international diplomacy and so, but perhaps not, I mean, there are worse out there. Is what I'm saying. So my just provocative question, what's really the problem with this, couldn't it actually be seen as a productive way of reading international, global politics at the time, at the moment, and that this is actually a platform for, well, rearranging what you say, some of these challenging domestic issues in the US as well, rallying around a conception of self, which indeed is in a position. So just to start.
So that's very helpful. And I do want to end up on the last point that you made. I'll just preview it with one line, and I'll come back to it, which is that sometimes paranoid people have reason to be paranoid. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But on the first two issues of Taiwan and human rights, I don't mean to signal anything by the fact that just in the initial presentation, I didn't mention them, but to me, they were embedded in some of the points I made, and I think they're both incredibly important. So I will happily take up the opportunity to say a few words more about those. The Taiwan issue in particular, I think, is likely the most difficult one for the US-China relationship in a landscape of difficult issues, and is the one that, if not carefully managed, could most easily spill out into real conflict. The way that successive US administrations have sought to manage that very, very complex issue has been to both signal a real deterrent effect towards China against their use of force to unify China and Taiwan, and at the same time to maintain a credible commitment to the One China policy that was part of the deal of normalizing relations in the first place in the 1970s, and is still our policy. We do not, as a matter of US government policy, we do not advocate for Taiwan independence. We do have a lot of clauses around our recognition of the one China policy that ultimately are most importantly focused on if there is to be a unification, it ought to be a peaceful one. But that has been kind of a very carefully constructed architecture that is maybe showing some fraying edges, especially under the Trump administration, even in some respects under the Biden administration, but is the best solution to preventing the kind of conflict that would be enormously destabilizing for the entire world. I think a U.S. Perspective that we've been talking a lot in these meetings that I've had the last week in different contexts is that Europeans are not serious enough about this issue. That, maybe the best example to pick on is President Macron's very unfortunate comments in the Les Echos interview after his meeting in Beijing on the plane back, which was frankly strongly criticized by many people in the kind of the French policy community who work on China. So it's not as if, the cavalier way that he spoke about Taiwan in that interview is embraced even within the French policy community. But on the whole, I think American policymakers wonder if Europeans are serious enough about this issue, if they realize how dangerous it can be and how carefully those twin messages of deterrence and commitment have to be articulated to prevent this from turning into something else. On human rights, I think human rights has always been part of the U.S. approach to China. It has ebbed and flowed as to how important it is at different times. It has gotten more attention or less attention. I am from that community personally. Like, I study law reform in China, and I particularly look at lawsuits against the government in China. So, I am by nature and by inclination, by my own interests, I think, maintaining a clear perspective on the ways in which China falls short in terms of human rights is important. I don't always know how much that is part of the European attitude towards China, and I think it varies. I think there are some members of the European Parliament who are more vocal about these issues, especially with the persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But I will say that even as someone who is committed to those issues and feels it important that we continue to shine a light on ways in which China falls short of the human rights that are embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted by a representative of, principally drafted, in fact, by the representative of the Chinese government at the time. What matters to me is that we be consistent in how we speak about human rights in China, how we speak about human rights in other parts of the world, and how we speak about human rights at home. So I am somewhat suspicious of people who view China through the lens of geopolitical competition, thinking that they can take the human rights part as well, when they don't really seem that interested in human rights in other parts. I'm much more comfortable with people who care about human rights in lots of different places, including our own, who are also critiquing human rights in China. But let me go back to what I mean, that paranoid people are sometimes right. So absolutely, and I'm very conscious in a deep way of the ways in which there's a tendency in the US to sometimes other, and that it's been part of how we construct our national identity, and that China fills that role right now in ways that are sort of hard to control. But China chose to play that role. That's the other part of it. It's not as if China was just, la-di-da, Xi Jinping is just happy-go-lucky, and we just decided we're going to make them the strategic competitor. China made a number of choices that walked into that role. And again, it becomes like a chicken and egg, and it's hard to sort of disentangle that to some degree. But I think it's important to just keep in mind that it's, again, like I certainly, and I very publicly often talk about the ways in which our construction of the China threat is not helpful, is not strategically wise. But China has contributed to that. And I think there are a lot of ways in which China has been coercive. It has been certainly economically coercive, where it feels it can do that. Just talk to the Australians about that. It has been increasingly militarily coercive in the South China Sea. I talked to the Filipinos about that. The U.S. would not have made so much progress under the Biden administration, bringing together different kinds of groupings of allies if those allies themselves didn't have real and legitimate and pressing concerns about China. Even if the allies, and I include many European countries, I include many Asian countries in that in this mix, even if they don't see it exactly the same way the US does, they are quite clear about the challenges that China is posing and want the US to be involved. But then it's just a question of how to shape that response as wisely and as carefully as possible.
Please, Marius.
Yeah, these are both really interesting questions, and they're connected. So I could draw out that connection. I'm going to quibble a little bit with your timeline on the first thing, and in two respects. One, again, because I am teaching this history of U.S.-China relations course myself, because it's the first time I've taught it, I have a much deeper appreciation for how deep and complicated the U.S.-China relationship is before 1972. Yes, 1949 to 1972 is this rupture, but pre-1949 is a very, very deep story that includes, the missionaries and their families. It includes U.S. support for the Kuomintang government in the 1930s and the 1940s. It includes, all these State Department diplomats out in the boondocks of China writing about the rising CCP. There's a lot that the 1972 onward story builds on. And I think because there's that rupture from 1949 to 1972-ish, 1971, we sometimes forget that. But I think it's important to remember that any ideas that are robust post-1971, and in fact, some of those were even kind of developing in the mid-1960s, about the benefits of engagement with China, they did not come out of whole cloth in that period. They were built on, the open door policy and, the very, very deep ways in which the U.S. and China were intertwined prior to 1949. So one point. The second point, what I would also quibble a little bit with your timeline, because I do think there was quite a lot of economic engagement in the 1980s. And what your timeline kind of misses is that 1989 was a rupture, right? 1989, the June 4th incident, there's a few years where there is an important rupture there. Now, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, did make a special effort to try to keep the relationship on track by sending these secret missions, even 3 weeks after the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, to talk to Deng Xiaoping to maintain kind of directionality. But we have to remember that 89 was, in the broader sense, a kind of a rupture. All of that said, what I will most robustly agree with is that starting in the 2016, 2017, 2018 period, you started to see a very robust argument develop out of the China watching community in the US that the philosophy, the ideology, the approach of engagement with China that had predominated for much of the last 40 years up to that point had failed. And there's a number of different people who articulated it in kind of persuasive ways at that time, but in particular, now Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell and now Assistant Secretary of Defense Eli Ratner published a piece in Foreign Affairs in 2018 titled The China Reckoning, in which they basically made the argument that China had not lived up to what the proponents of engagement had counted on. It had not liberalized politically, it had not liberalized economically. And so the entire edifice of why we were engaging with China had to be re-examined because of those objective realities. And, in terms of that metric, which I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, of, China moving in more illiberal directions, That's only become more clear since 2018. It's not as if 2018 was a stopping waypoint. China has become more liberal on both of those things. But I think to the extent that there are still some people in the US context who still are uncomfortable with this notion that engagement failed, and I very much include myself in that, I think the arguments that we have, which are not the winning arguments in DC right now, we are the minority. But to the extent that we counter that position that engagement failed, one, we think it misses a lot of the ways in which Chinese society changed over the last 40 years that are important and can be hard to reverse even under a leader like Xi Jinping. And that leads to a second, and probably still the same point, which is that maybe it's not so much that engagement failed, but it hasn't succeeded yet. Those of us who have that approach, we think in those terms, that it matters what your time frame is and how you're looking at it. But if you see all the ways in which Chinese society has changed in 40 years from what it was at the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution to what it is today, and you see that there is quite a lot of pluralism even within kind of the Chinese imagination, even with the rise of Xi Jinping and the revitalization of the party ideology and the party structures and control mechanisms, all of that. If you see that, it's very hard to say that engagement has completely failed. And then I think again, this is not the dominant view, but for those of us who are inclined to think this way, it holds the seeds of further change down the road that would, again, make the point that engagement just has not succeeded yet. So that's the best I can answer that point. But to the extent that the dominant thinking in Washington continues to be that engagement failed, it's because of those reasons that Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner wrote about in 2018, that China had simply not liberalized politically or economically in the ways that the idea of engagement had promised it would. And just as you were talking, I realized that I didn't fully answer your question about the European contributions and the terminology like de-risking. So I want to get back to that as well. But maybe I'll say a few things about your question, and I'll circle back to that. So I think there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to kind of wade through the territory you just laid out. And one way that I can make a useful intervention is to just contrast our thinking about the comprehensive CPP, TP, comprehensive and progressive. That's what I always forget, the progressive part. Comprehensive and progressive, help me out. Trans-Pacific Partnership, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, which was an American idea, right? And our very clear, I think, conception, and this is, Obama administration period, was that by promoting a certain vision of trade and reduction of certain barriers to trade, we would put a virtuous pressure on China that it would actually have a hydraulic effect, because China would want to be part of a grouping like that, that China would steer in the directions that we wanted it to do, precisely because it wanted the benefits of the trade agreement. That's a relic of a different age at this point, and as you know better than anyone. And what is amazing is how I think little we've really thought through some of these other ideas, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and how little we seem to still believe in the approach that underlay the thinking of the CPTPP. There's a quote I saw recently from the new head of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he says, Michael Froman, right, who comes from a trade background, of course, and he said something like, back then in the 90s, 2000s, we thought that China was going to become more like us, and in fact, we've become more like China. we have abandoned a lot of the, and now there may be some, that's a very hard nut to kind of totally disentangle, because the approach, the neoliberal trade approach that was predominant in earlier periods did have, a lot of negative consequences on American society and certain people and certain jobs, so, I'm sympathetic to the, general idea of a quote unquote worker-centered trade policy. But we have moved a long way away from kind of this ideas about free and open markets that I think were prevalent before, and much closer to ideas that seem almost Chinese in the emphasis on, supporting our own industries. And so that's one kind of comment. I might come back to that, but let me now just say one thing about the question you asked about, the point you made about how the Europeans have contributed to, in a positive way, from helping the Americans move away from the terminology of decoupling to the terminology of de-risking. It is some kind of a moderating influence. And to my mind, that's exactly what we want Europe to contribute into this very, very difficult picture between the US and China. Ideally, we want Europeans, and I say we, I don't mean the US government. I just mean, maybe I'm representing just China scholars who don't want the relationship to completely fall off the tracks, whatever that grouping is. That, if Europeans can come up with more nuanced approaches, we can certainly say that de-risking is a more nuanced approach than decoupling. If they can contribute that, and in a way that is effective, that's great. And so I think that should be really the main goal of, transatlantic dialogue about China, is not so much the Americans, pulling the Europeans with us in every respect, but the Europeans injecting some nuance in a way that they can right now. It's very hard for us to do it because of the nature of US-China relations. Then I'll just circle back to this. Then these trade questions, I think, they do kind of complicate the EU, the European and US sort of possibility of, because if we are taking sort of more protectionist measures, that also impacts our transatlantic relations. And I think, the Europeans have noticed that. They say, well, are we on the same side now? We're on the same side. Like, why are you subsidizing certain industries in these ways, right? Like, now the Europeans probably still have to be more concerned about state capitalism from China, right? It's not the Americans who are about to wipe out the European electric car vehicle industry by, injecting very cheap electric cars. But it is one of the interesting challenges in the European-US relationship around China that it's not always clear that we are totally consistent vis-a-vis the Europeans about some of those ideas that used to be the way that we would try to develop commonality with the Europeans in terms of liberal and national order.
Do you agree with the characterization that de-risking was pushed by Europe?
Sure, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. I do think we are now trying to redefine de-risking, so it sounds more like decoupling. But absolutely, it's the case that the Europeans, we were very much stuck in the language of decoupling, and it's because of the Europeans that we've moved to this other language of de-risking, which, as long as the terms mean what they originally meant, is a more moderate form. But I'm curious, just to, I mean, what do you think of this picture of, like, what do you think of, like, how the U.S. views trade today compared to how it viewed it 10 years ago, and does that complicate things for us vis-a-vis the Europeans? I mean, you're one of the experts on this, so.
Again, it's a huge question, and the U.S. Trade Representative Kathy Tai is about to speak to Congress on this topic in an hour.
Excellent.
So we're just waiting.
Good timing.
She says there. But I was really just asking that follow-up because when I was in the U.S. government 10 years ago, it was very much a pull from Europe to get them to come along and see China the way we did. And they didn't. And ultimately, that had consequences that we will never be able to measure. And so many meeting in Brussels trying to say, you need to join us on this issue and see China's bad, doing this bad thing, and this bad thing. Here is the action step we can take to go to do this together. And Brussels refusing to do it. And I agree the relationship is different now. But that remains, I think, still a feeling among many in the government that we just, we're not on the same page, and Europe will never go far enough for us.
The US government is also not very homogeneous when it comes to the
That's true, that's true. And interlocutors matter. So the question that we could have asked you was also on my list of things. You know, sending Janet versus sending Catherine. And, you know, the State Department goes, this is our ask, right? And the Treasury Department goes, this is our ask. When we talk to Europe, we're largely talking we are. So there's already a disconnect there. One that I'm not sure is very productive. It makes us think that all the issues with China now are currency issues, but we're not going to move on 301. There's no phase 2 deal. So if the trade issues are all frozen, then everything's now a currency issue, right? So there's, I think the question of what is on the economic table is a live one, which complicates again our we're not sending the same people. Janet's not even going to Brussels, right?
And part of, I mean, building on this, I think a reasonable critique of U.S. policy towards China. And again, I'm trying very much to indicate that there are real things to be concerned about, and not to diminish in any way that China poses real challenges, but also to inject some questioning of the precise way in which the U.S. is trying to address this challenge, and adopting the same kind of perspective vis-a-vis Europe, that there are some ways in which Europe potentially can play a productive role and has played a productive role, and there are some ways in which Europe may be, you know, whether again European countries or EU as a whole, is still is not as sharp as we need Europeans to be on these issues. So I'm trying to play all of those notes, and so on just maybe the note that is kind of questioning some aspects of U.S. policy, I think it is a reasonable question to ask. What exactly do we want? Because we ask a lot of different things at different times, and so it's sometimes hard to really kind of like, what is it exactly that is if the Chinese do this, is that's what we want, or is it if they do that? And to my mind, you know, again, this is not the overall answer, but part of the answer is, or at least part of a perspective on that question that I think is useful, is that whatever are the particular things China is doing across these different areas that are problematic and we genuinely have real legitimate concerns about, partly it's also just a story of us and maybe some of the figures in Europe who think like us on these issues having trouble just getting used to the fact that China is stronger. And, you know, that's just something that I think we still struggle with. And it helps to explain partly why we kind of jump around. Like one day it's this set of issues, another day it's this set of issues. And those are real issues. So that's why I don't want to, you know, push it too far in that direction. But to some degree, it's just true that like we are having trouble accepting that China is just economically stronger and militarily stronger, and that just means that you know, the path, like we can't bomb China out of that. I mean, maybe like we could try, but like that's going to be enormously, you know, just terrible for anything that I think people would care about. So so you have to find a different way around that. And I think in DC, we are still stuck. We still are having trouble coming up with this wise approach. And ideally, Europeans would help us. Europeans would help us to do that, not just a one way we telling the Europeans what to do, but the Europeans kind of informing. But to do that, the Europeans have to be serious. They have to come with like real knowledge and real kind of depth of their own kind of insights into the relationship with China. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for that to work, for that dynamic of having the European nuance come into our policy discourse to really be effective. And that, I mean, that I'm just, when I say that, I'm thinking about like the Taiwan issue, you know, because I do think on that particular issue, there isn't a sufficient level of seriousness in a lot of the European perspectives about it.
Yeah, we can call that a form of strategic ignorance, I think, right? There is an advantage to not knowing this much about certain issues.
Strategic ambiguity versus strategic ignorance.
Nice new paper.
Yeah, I mean, those are many very, very, very important points. It'll be challenging for me to give a comprehensive answer to all of that. So I'll just try to say two simple things. One is that in terms of your question about what's the landscape going forward, again, as someone who thinks that engagement has not succeeded yet, but that it has had real noticeable important contributions already. I tend to be optimistic about the longer term picture. And in the wider context of thinking about just even US-China relations over the last 200 years, that also helps, you know, when you realize how many times there have been this like kind of difficult periods. And but it's very clear that this next period ahead will be difficult. And so I think a lot about just how do we get from point A to point B? How do we get to the other side of it without, you know, like having some kind of a bridge that we know will be rickety and we know will be terrifying, but ideally we don't fall off it until we get to the safer ground on the other side. That's to me the best we can kind of hope for, but I do see another side. It just, I don't know if it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. That is hard to say. And what will make the bridge rickety will be competition in a lot of different respects, but I think tech competition in particular, I'm really glad you brought it up because tech competition will be very high on the list. You know, that's the kind of thing that can be fully robust as competition in a way that if like, you know, competition over Taiwan or the South China Sea becomes really robust, we fall off the bridge. But you can still kind of stay on the bridge with robust tech competition, but it can be very, very robust. And I think what is a challenge is that some of our thinking of what yields innovation is being challenged by the way that a country that doesn't have a lot of those things that we thought were important for innovation is actually innovating. That's a challenge. And again, that goes to the broader point I made earlier, which is to some extent, the problem here is the US just finding a way to accept that this other system that has not exactly turned into what we had hoped it would turn into is not going away and is actually you know, competitive with us in ways that we didn't think they were capable of being competitive. And tech competition is a great example of that. You know, it's, you know, do you need to have a certain kind of, you know, private, open environment for tech innovation? We really believe that. And maybe that's ultimately, you know, I'm not a tech person, maybe ultimately, if you think about the steps that China's taken that have been innovative in tech, it all builds on, you know, an environment from before that was more open, that was, you know, more along the lines that we think is important for innovation. But right now, in the model they have now, it's a different kind of environment, but they are still innovating. It's just hard to reconcile. So, you know, again, like the analogy of the bridge is the best that I can come up with. I do genuinely, and in ways that I think there are a lot of people who don't see the others, and I just mean in DC in particular, who don't see the other side of the bridge, who just see the systemic rivalry. I can see the other side, but I can't tell how long it's going to take us to get to that other side. And in the meantime, we're going to be on a very, very unstable and rickety bridge that ideally we don't fall off, but we could. That's interesting. I don't know that I have a particular answer on Brexit. But I do think that in terms of what Kathleen was saying earlier about trying to get Brussels on board with the US in recognizing the economic challenge that China poses, this current moment may be the most promising for that, because it's so clear that China's strategy for improving its lately rather dismal economy will be flooding the international market with cheap goods. And that puts Europe in a tough position. You know, again, like the entire European electric vehicle capacity could be decimated. You know, that entire industry is gone in a short matter of time, unless, you know, Europe takes certain kinds of protectionist steps. That are the kinds of things that, you know, maybe they were resistant to do earlier, but the nature of that challenge, I think, is going to become much clearer in this next period of time.
Okay. Any other final points? Do you have any?
No, I mean, these were really good questions and you know, challenging questions. You know, I am curious if you have any final. You started with a reaction at the beginning. I want to see if you have some concluding reactions.
Concluding reaction. I mean, I think it's I mean, it's super interesting to see this perspective. It's extremely, I mean, your rich knowledge about these processes and, you know, the shifts and the different communities that are pushing in different directions and so on. I mean, this is just very enriching, I think. I think there is a lot of things going on right now, right? I mean, the world is, and also Europe's near abroad with what happens in the Middle East at the moment.
Sure.
Is pulling, not least also Ukraine, is pulling Europe in many ways very closer to home, right? Mm. So it was always a bit of a tough one to bring Europe on board with this relatively far away from its perspective, not seeing so much of these threats of, you know, the Chinese and the economy perhaps, and thinking about other issues, right? So when it was always difficult and we having these, you know, closer to home, what I think feels like rather existential challenges here. I just curious, you know, like this would be my conclusion and maybe also yours, if I understand correctly, that the three options that you outlined, so Europe will be softer in China, it will follow the US line, or it will be, you know, having some serious divergence. I think you're probably likely to see both 1 and 3. Mm. It will, I think, the EU as such, it's not going to pick these battles. Mm. And that has to do with unity in Europe. And, you know, I mean, Europe will always have divergence. It's who we are. We are, you know, not the United States of Europe, right? And so all these divergences, they will continue to shape the landscape here. And Europe, I think, is getting increasingly more looking at our own frail, you know, the foundations upon which Europe rests. And so I'm kind of concerned. And if you didn't also not talk so much, I mean, there's so many things and, you know, the range of questions, but AUKUS, no? Sure. AUKUS, is it going to be, I mean, you know, this and the way that also Europeans were perhaps felt a little bypassed by that. I mean, there are a series of, I think, sort of broader dynamics that are pulling in the direction that Europe is not necessarily going to play this. Yeah. And then it's the smart power, right? Like Marius highlights, concept travel, concept formation, and yeah, I don't know. I'm just reflecting on the top of the go
So
here,
the
but-
only thing I'll add is, and this is not so much as a China expert, but as someone who has had a lot more engagement with Europe over the last 3 years than at any point earlier in my career, and these bookended by my October 2021 visit here in this very room, and then this visit now some years later in 2024. I think I'm much more interested and activated on this question of what is Europe than I was before. And again, like, should Europe have a collective foreign policy? Should the European kind of identity be more than just the economic linkages and be something broader? I know that's these kinds of questions that in this beautiful surrounding everyone is mostly thinking about. And I think I'm much more interested in those questions now than I think I knew about earlier. And I think the rise of China at a minimum will provoke further thinking about that. It's the kind of thing that will be hard. It will be hard to ignore. And so if there is something that may yield more European unity beyond just the economic linkages that have been, I think, the primary driver of European identity up to now, it could be for this reason.
Interesting. Well, Neysun Mahboubi, thank you so much for coming to the Robert Schuman Center here at the EUI. Thank you for a very insightful analysis on this important topic, US, China, and Europe, whatever that might be in the end. And yeah, join me in thanking Neysun.